Welcome to the Ask Historians podcast.
Hello, and welcome to the Ask Historians podcast. My name is Morgan Lewin. I am one of the moderators over Ask Historians, writing under the username A Quartermain, and joining me today is fellow moderator Stefan Aguirre Quiroga. He is a historian based in Borås, Sweden, and his research focuses primarily on historical memory. His book, Mythic Space, Racism, the First World War, and Battlefield 1, is out now. Hello and welcome, Stefan.
Thank you very much, Morgan. It's a pleasure to be here. Before we get started, I am going to invite the audience, the listener, to join in a little bit of experiment here, because I want you, hopefully you're not sitting in your car right now and driving somewhere, because I want you to sort of imagine what I'm about to tell you, because I'm going to read an actual account from the First World War, written by a British gunner in the Royal Field Artillery from 1917. Well, he wrote this, years after the war, but it takes place on July 26, 1917, in the days leading up to the Battle of Passchendaele. It was just at dusk when they opened a terrific artillery fire on the wood. In 5 minutes, half of our men were dead or wounded. Those who could ran out, and among those running was my brother Roy, carrying on his back a man thought to be wounded. It turned out he was dead. And then he too fell, killed by a shell that burst a little distance off and sent a small fragment of its casing straight into his heart. We buried him with others the next day, all wrapped up in blankets and placed in a field already established in anticipation of the battle, not far from where we had our camp. I cannot speak of how I felt. We were good friends, and I was to be lonely for the rest of the war, lonely and bitter. Roy had a fine mind and a large and generous love of life and people. He intended to make writing his career and spent all his spare time when he was not talking to people writing short stories and scenarios for the cinema. Now, as you listen to this, you probably see a scarred battlefield. Probably you can imagine the mud or the rain. And a lot of these themes that are brought up in this account sort of speak to very established ideas that already exist in popular culture around the First World, the futility and the loss. Now, when you, the listener, when you saw these soldiers, particularly Roy, who carried this man thought to be wounded but who was actually dead off the battlefield, did you imagine them as white? Now, what if I told you that the man who wrote this account, Norman Manley, and his brother, Douglas Roy Manley, were biracial? That these two men were not born in the British Isles, but actually in Jamaica. And that Norman Manley, the man who wrote this account, would one day become the first premier of Jamaica. Now, I imagine most of you would be like, oh, that's pretty cool. Like, I definitely, that changes the mind you have in your head. And that's sort of what we expect, right? That, you're given facts and this will change your perception of it. But my research focuses on those people who don't do that, who are unable to do that, and who try in all their might to reject people of color from the past.
Well, as people listening at home, or probably and hopefully not in their cars, can imagine, this is going to be a particularly thought-provoking episode. So to start us off, there is a tendency to sometimes confuse academic history with other forms of history, like the way in which scholars represent and create narratives about history, and other different ways of portraying or you're representing history, and you specialize in something that is very different, that is historical memory. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
So, as you mentioned, there are different ways of seeing history. So, we got the past, which is everything that has happened in the actual past. So, when you went to bed last night, what you ate for breakfast, all those things that have happened and that you know, and so on. Um, the other thing is history, which is the academic study of the past. So that's historians, scholars interpreting uh, the past based on specific source material. And then there's something completely different, which is historical memory. And this is how people, not necessarily just historians, but people like anyone, remembers the past. And historical memory is influenced by a lot of things because historical memory is something that is constructed. And what those sort of building blocks to construct a specific historical memory of an event or a person, whatever, comes from very different sources. So that does include actually scholarly books, but more commonly it draws from everything from school classes, like when you went to school and you learned about history when you were in like first grade or whatever, to even more popular things like movies or video games or music or historical novels, statues, monuments, artworks, anything you can imagine where people have represented history. That's usually where people get their ideas about what history might have been. But historical memory is not usually based on historical scholarship. It's based on other ideas that usually is constructed. So, for example, usually when people bring up, let's say, the D-Day invasion, of course, Normandy, 1944, what people usually think of when they think of Omaha Beach is the opening scene from Saving Private Ryan. That's historical memory. That's not facts. That's a representation, artistic representation of the past. um so that in a nutshell is what historical memory is.
I think that we are living in a time in which historical memory is very much at the forefront of many conversations, particularly in public media in general. Uh, of course, most of us who don't live in the US end up being exposed to different situations that happen in the US, whether it be, uh, I don't know, the remembrance of Columbus Day, or statues being torn down, uh, to even, I don't know, sports teams changing their names to avoid perpetuating racism. But it is something that happens in many other countries as well. Living in Argentina and being an Argentinian, uh, historical memory is very much a part of our everyday life because of how close and recent the events of the last military dictatorship are. Um, and I think that it's very interesting and it's very important for scholars to dive into historical memory as an entirely different set of sources, if you will. Uh, because, like you were saying, historical memory can be a multitude of things. Historical memory doesn't necessarily have to come from a letter written by someone or from a journal entry. uh, it can happen in the most varied of ways. I mean, there are historians these days who are specializing in graffiti, for example, and the way in which graffiti functions as a piece of historical memory and also as a piece of, as a form of transmitting ideology or transmitting concepts and religion and many different things. Um, but particularly your research, and in this book you are introducing a concept that is a concept that you came up with yourself, which is the idea of the white mythic space. And I am very interested, and I'm sure our listeners are also very interested in getting to understand what exactly it is that you mean by white mythic space.
The white mythic space is a theoretical term that I coined in order to sort of understand what it is these people really believe in. Now, a mythic space is described by Richard Slotkin, the cultural historian, as, quote, a pseudo historical or pseudo real setting that is powerfully associated with stories and concerns rooted in the cultural myth slash ideological tradition. So, sort of to put it more plainly, a mystic space is sort of like the landscape for specific myths. Okay. Now, Richard Slotkin was writing about the American West. He was writing about the ideas that Americans in particular have about the Wild West, about this um, place that has had been so, written about and represented on screen so much. Um, but a white mystic space, the way I saw it was that I am more, I am more concerned about who populates that space, and that's what the white mystic space is. It is a place which is reimagined as being homogeneously white. So the original space in a white mystic space can be both a real physical landscape, so it can be, well, as we just talked about, the Omaha Beach during D-Day, or it can be a fictional landscape that has been constructed from real contemporary or historical analogs. So things like Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, for example. These are obviously fictional places, but they have a deep, often historical sort of basis. Um, but the setting is of a secondary importance because a white mystic space is more concerned with who populates the landscape, and that's, in a nutshell, is what it is. It is a pseudo historical or fictional space that has been reimagined and transformed into a racially homogeneous space in which non-white elements have been erased or minimized. So even something that is already fictional, let's say Star Wars again, for people who believe in the white mystic space of Star Wars, they can't imagine Star Wars being a diverse place where people of African ancestry can be depicted, despite the fact that obviously we know one of the most famous Star Wars characters of all time is Lando Calrissian, played by Billy D. Williams. That's sort of what it is. Now, the white mystic space, which is again a reimagined and sort of a fictionalized idea of either the past or something fictional, is then perceived as an authentic and legitimate representation of that place. So it is practically a distortion of an already fictionalized space in favor of white homogeny and in stark opposition to reality, whether that is manifested in actual scholarly historical research or the intentions of the original creators of the fictional universe, depending on what you're studying.
I think it's very interesting that you bring up things that are so popular as Lord of the Rings or Star Wars, or well, even in the particular case of your book, the video game Battlefield One, um, because again, historical memory is, like you said, it's not factual. Historical memory is constructed, but it can be constructed in a way in which it is heavily repressive and restrictive to the subaltern, to the colonized, uh, or the marginalized in general. So I find it particularly interesting to discuss these issues, because again, we are living in a time in which so many of these issues are being discussed, so many of this I don't know. I think that at this point, everyone who is on the internet has seen the backlash that the new Lord of the Rings TV show has received because of some of the choices in casting, because of the ethnicity of certain characters that are, according to people who live in this white mythic space, they shouldn't be anything other than white. Um, which is, I think, well, first of all, it's very dangerous and just generally detrimental to any kind of social progress that one might try to achieve. Uh, but it's also interesting to see how people can believe and make themselves believe that it's the rest of the world that is making a distortion, that is creating a distortion about something that they are invested in, when in many occasions it is in fact themselves who are distorting historical reality. They are distorting the construction of actual scholarly history. Like, for example, if you look at historical and archaeological evidence regarding stuff like Lord of the Rings, for example, and the places in which Lord of the Rings, in which Tolkien found inspiration for the Lord of the Rings, you will look and you will find that there were people of African ancestry living in most parts of Europe for thousands of years. It's not something that's new. It's not something that historians are only finding out about now. Uh, but it is definitely something that a lot of people have been led to believe against, or that at least a lot of people reject, because that is how we have constructed these narratives. And by we, I mean societies in general over the last couple of hundreds of years, ever since the emergence of nation states in Europe and in other parts of the world, at least the modern version of a nation state. So I think that it would be interesting for us to explore a little bit the construction of these mythic spaces when it comes to, at the same time, the construction of national mythos. And I thought that we could just have a little chat about well, two regions and two countries that we are both very familiar with, which are Argentina and Chile.
The white mystic space is considered sort of a model of authenticity. So white bodies are seen as authentic, and non-white bodies are seen as sort of inaccurate. That they don't belong here, sort of thing. It is almost like a racial segregation in a way, in which these people want a specific white sphere that is separated from a black sphere, because black sphere don't belong in this white sphere. This is only for white people, and so on and so on. And I do need to bring out that the white mystic space is sort of an extreme form of historical memory. It is almost like a weaponized form of historical memory, because it is used to reject people of color from spaces that are seen as white. Historical memory in usually is, there are different strands of historical memory, and sometimes they sort of they clash, and we see that a lot in the US, in over the debates over statues, and in other countries about the monuments and so on, where they clash. But sometimes one takes over, and then another one comes and then takes over that strand, while the white mystic space is is a very essentialist in its way. There's only one. There can't be any questioning of it, because if you're questioning it, you're wrong, and that's it. Now we're gonna turn our attention to history and to a region that we're both very familiar with, as you just introduced. Um, there are exterior ideas, so international ideas about South America, and that is usually that South America is a place of brown people. But what is interesting to notice here is that this isn't always the case from within. So, in the case of Chile, which is a diverse society, is a multicultural society, people haven't always seen that as sort of a strength or something to be proud of. In the late 19th century, well, actually throughout the 19th century, there was the beginnings of the construction of something that came to known as La Raza Chilena, the Chilean race. And it began in the 19th century, and it really picked up after a big conflict called the War of the Pacific between 1879 and 1884, in which Chile faced off against its neighbors to the north, Peru and Bolivia. And as part of Chilean nationalism at this time, we're talking really late 19th century, the Chilean elites in particular began to promote an idea that the Peruvians, the Bolivians, they were racially inferior to the Chileans. The Chileans were more white than their neighbors. And the Chileans were imbued with specific racial characteristics, with racial characteristics that were specific to them, which their enemies did not. So we obviously have a very early construction here of the other, um, in which the Peruvians, they were cowardly, they were feminized, they were everything that the valiant white Chilean heroes were not. And this was obviously not actually the case, but this was the image that was brought forward by the Chilean elite, that the valiant Chilean soldier was a white man, el roto chileno, the legendary idea of a Chilean masculinity during warfare, was a white man, and this would continue to be developed uh, and reached a very very specific height during the turn of the 20th century, which is something that Sarah Walsh has called the myth of Chilean racial homogeny, which she says that obviously in 1904, to go back all the way to 1904, there was a Chilean author whose name was Nicolás Palacio, and Nicolás Palacio wrote a book called La Raza Chilena, and which is means the Chilean race, and essentially he wrote a very very specific book where he essentially tried to differentiate Chileans from the rest of Latin Americans, saying that we Chileans were white, we're a white society, and that's why we're superior. And that's a very interesting thing for someone who's maybe not from South America to think about, because there are very very many predominant ideas about how race in Latin America really is. And in all actuality, me, Morgan, we both acknowledge the fact that this is an incredibly complicated question when it really comes down to it. And it is obviously influenced by ideas that have existed in South America since colonization itself. Because, and I'm pretty sure Morgan you can join me in on this. The Spanish colonizers had very specific categorization of race, that went beyond just the normal three, sort of like the African, the indigenous, and the white European.
Yes, I think it's a very long tradition. The way in which Latin America, but I think particularly South America, has constructed their ideas of whiteness, because like you said, it comes first and foremost from the conquistadores, from the Spanish conquest, and just the way in which they built their social hierarchy here. Um, just because one of the things, which is something that usually comes up in Ask Historians, one of the things that people, particularly from the northern hemisphere, don't usually know is that the colonization of Latin America was done in a very different way to the colonization of North America, particularly so because uh, the Spanish were much more uninterested in in the negative aspects of well, of reproducing with native people and with uh, black slaves. They just didn't really care, uh, and which is something that I have found that comes as a shock for to many people from the United States or from Europe or from North America in general, um, which is the fact that an overwhelming amount of people here in Latin America, uh, myself included, are descended from natives or from African slaves, uh, far more so than in North America. But I think it's interesting that you bring up Nicolas Palacios, because he is an interesting character as a part of an entire generation of Latin American and South American thinkers, and um, that were so heavily influenced by social Darwinism. You know, uh, it, one of the I think that the main parallel that I can find here in Argentina with Palacios would be Domingo Faustino Sarmiento, who ended up being the president of Argentina in the 1870s. Um, and Sarmiento was a very interesting character because he spent a lot of his youth traveling. He spent many years in Chile, and he also spent many years in North America and in Europe. And when he came back to Argentina, he had become a defender of social Darwinism and the concepts and the ideas behind social Darwinism. He was an avid reader of Malthus and of Spencer. He was a big fan. He wrote a book that is called Facundo o la civilización y barbarie, Civilization or Barbarism, which is a very interesting exploration and interesting in by interesting I mean terrifyingly racist and just generally awful, but very interesting nonetheless. It is an exploration of what he considered to be the divide between uh, civilized people, that is, in Argentina's case, the people from Buenos Aires and from the largest cities in general, and the people from the rest of the country, from what he called the interior, uh, people who were uneducated, people who were usually typically on the browner end of the spectrum, so to speak. Um, and it is a book that is taught here in high school in general, because it illustrates just how deeply ingrained these Eurocentric beliefs of white superiority and supremacy over brownness and blackness uh, have always been in South American history. In Argentina's case, in general, I think it starts with the creation of the first official history textbooks written by Argentina's first constitutional president, Bartolome Mitre, who created a narrative around the Revolutionary Wars and the independence movement that made it seem like the entirety of the fight was carried out by white people, by direct descendants of Spanish colonizers. Uh, and one of the main key figures in this particular narrative is José de San Martín, who is the Argentinian version of George Washington, uh, to to make a completely anachronistic parallelism, who was has always tended to be represented as an ideal white male, uh, just a very tall, a very white, very manly man. And in recent decades, there have been some scholars who have been trying to pursue an idea that still may or may not be true. We don't have enough evidence to prove it, but the idea that perhaps San Martin wasn't white, or at least he wasn't completely white, uh, because San Martin was the son of a landowner in the northern regions of Argentina, um, and for most of Argentina's history, his mother was always assumed to have been uh, his father's wife. But there are some scholars who have found certain evidence that may point out to the fact that maybe his real mother was a servant, a native servant. So, coming back to the categorization you were mentioning, that would make Jose de San Martin Argentina's founding father, Argentina's libertador, our liberator, the man who crossed the Andes and helped uh, Chile and Peru gain independence from Spain, a mestizo, a half blood. So um, I think that it's fascinating to explore these concepts because I should reiterate this is only a theory for now. There is no concrete evidence yet to prove that Jose de San Martin was biracial. But the very fact that people are starting to talk about these things, that people are starting to consider this, the possibility that this national mythos wasn't necessarily always the case. Uh, I think that it brings up some very interesting questions regarding what exactly is the line that divides historical memory from scholarly history, from academic history, when some of that academic history was written through the lens of historical memory.
And we cannot ignore just how important just the notion of the mestizo population is in South America, particularly in Chile, for example, where even Nicolas Palacio, obviously, he had to admit to the fact that, yeah, the Chilean race is a mestizo race, but are the European genes are those that are predominant, he said in his very eugenics sort of way of saying. But he would also add, used to, this mental gymnastics here that we're talking about, which is going to sound really weird to anyone who hasn't studied these sort of late 19th century texts. He's like, the natives of Chile, los Araucanos, actually, that's the term he uses, but obviously we would use the Mapuche today. Uh, they are superior than the native peoples of Argentina or Peru or Bolivia. So more or less in his very offensive words, we got the better Indians, and therefore we are all have also have a stronger race. Important in this context too is that there is no talk about people of African descent. African enslaved Africans were brought both to Chile and to Argentina. They were present. Um, and Nicola Palacio, for example, uses an argument that I have even found amongst a lot of the people I have researched during my time, where he said that, well, there's so few Africans in Chile. We don't really need to care about them. They don't matter. They didn't left a genetic imprint on the Chilean race anyhow. Now, obviously, he's trying to make an argument that the Chilean race is untainted, that it only has indigenous, good, within quotation mark, good indigenous blood, and the sort of and white blood. It doesn't have anything to do, hasn't been contaminated with black blood. And a lot of the same arguments we see even now in the 20th century, a sort of historical racism being repeated here, where it's sort of like these white spaces haven't have does not there are no people of African ancestry in 17th century Europe. Like that's a common argument, and we see this repeated over and over again. Now, talking about these sort of national mythos, Jose de San Martin, of course, the liberator for us from the southern cone of South America. If you're from the northern parts of South America, you might obviously be more fond of Simon Bolivar. Uh, but when he came to liberate Chile during the Chilean War of Independence, he famously crossed the Andes with the Army of the Andes, El Ejército de los Andes. And what is interesting to remember, again, I appeal to you, listener, when I say the Army of the Andes, and an army that was based in Argentina, in Mendoza, crossed the Andes with a mixture of Argentinian and Chilean soldiers. Would you believe me if I told you that 40% of El Ejército de los Andes were people of African descent? 40%. And these are the sort of ideas that we have about historical memory, that these are clouded in the present. Now, commonly, there are historical reenactments of the Battle of Chacabuco in 1817, one of the great battles of the Chilean War of Independence. The Army of the Andes they come off the Andes, they immediately face a Spanish force at Chacabuco, and they defeat them. Big nationalist sort of like imagery you can only imagine. In reenactments that are carried out even today, you won't see a single black face anywhere.
And I think that is deeply problematic, because it's something that is so thoroughly ingrained in the way our societies have been constructed. Because I was raised and I live in Mendoza. I live uh, less than 200 kilometers away from where San Martin crossed the Andes, and a very very large number of the people who fought in the army of the Andes, in el Ejército de los Andes, were from Mendoza and from the other provinces in the region that is called Cuyo. And we don't get taught that 40% of the Ejército de los Andes was black. We that that's not part of our history, and part of the curriculum in general, of course, is talking about how important the province and the region was in designing the entire process of crossing the Andes, because it was the only place in the entirety of the border, which is a very long border. The Andes are very long, and Argentina and Chile share a very long border. And it was the only place in which it made sense to cross, for it to be able to, for the entirety of the plan that San Martin and Bernardo Higgins had come up with. And we refuse to teach that. We refuse to look at our history and analyze it in a through a deeper and more comprehensive and critical lens when it comes to ethnicity and race, and the roles that people of color played, and not only descendants of African slaves, but also descendants of natives, or even natives themselves, because there were natives that fought in the army of the Andes. There were many of them. San Martin was very aware that he needed as many men as he could possibly muster to be able to achieve the goal of helping Chile gain independence, because it was the only way to keep Argentina safe at the time. Um, and he made deals with many native tribes, particularly in the southern regions of Mendoza province. He made deals with my ancestors, uh, allowing them to remain free, and to just be able to live their lives freely in the province after the liberation of Chile was over. But that's not something that we talk about. Just as you mentioned, we don't talk about just how many people are still today descended from African slaves. In Argentina, uh, when the last population census was carried out over a decade ago, there were over 150,000 people who identify as Afro-Argentines, and over 1.5 million people who are either Afro-Argentines or descended from African immigrants who came following the Declaration of Independence. And at the time, Argentina was only 45 million people strong. So we are talking a very important part of a very important portion of Argentinian population that is black, that identifies as black, as Afro-Argentine, and that it's still something that we have a lot of trouble understanding as a society, and as such, our historical memory has been shaped by this misconception that Argentina is a white country. Very much as you were mentioning, Stefan, in Chile's case, it is very similar here as well. When Argentina passed the law of immigration in 1876 during Nicolás Avellaneda's presidency, um, the idea was to bring immigration that was ideal. Because the law of immigration and colonization stated that new immigrants would be granted land for farming and for cattle raising, and they would be afforded a certain amount of money to at least get settled, so long as they decided to stay and inhabit the country. And the idea was to attract, or to, at least to try and attract, um, rich European people or rich North American people, primarily European, because uh, the oligarchy that was running the country in the late 19th century, they believed that Argentina's race could be improved by bringing French and English and German high society to live here. But what ended up happening was that, yes, a lot of white European people came here. I am descended from white European Jewish people. But the people who ended up coming here were poor people, destitute people, uh, anarchists, communists, criminals, people who were escaping famine, who were escaping political persecution. Uh, and even so, we have managed here in Argentina to create a narrative that makes us believe that Argentina's white population is descended from sort of an ideal race, like the Atlanteans or something like that, from people who came with wealth, with power, who came to make this country a better place. And in reality, they were just trying to escape. They were just trying to escape war, suffering, poverty, disease. Um, and that is also something that I think it's important to keep in mind. Even white people, uh, even when discussing their own whiteness, usually end up failing to realize and to see that the that the country that they arrived at, that the country that these immigrants ended up finding themselves in, wasn't actually welcoming them, because the country was expecting something else. They didn't have easy lives. They weren't given gigantic estates. They were given pieces of land in the middle of nowhere just so they could survive. So I think there are so many nuances, and I think we could stay here forever just talking about these issues, because there are so many nuances when it comes to analyzing the construction of these white mythic spaces, particularly so in South America, and particularly so in our respective countries of interest.
This is all incredibly accurate, and we see this throughout Latin America, attempts to by the local elites to quote unquote widening the images of their countries. Brazil, for example, in the late 19th century, tried to do the same. It's interesting to note that there are attempts to provide a historically accurate popular culture representation of the past. I'm thinking specifically about the film El Cruce de los Andes from 2010, San Martin, El Cruce de los Andes, which actually does involve a great deal of soldiers of African ancestry actually being depicted as being part of the Army of the Andes, which is really, really cool. Um, and that's the way you should do it. But obviously, popular imagination doesn't. So, for example, when you try to do that in another context, let's say the film 1917 from 2019, there was a big outcry because people just couldn't imagine that black British soldiers did indeed fight in otherwise all white regiments, which is a proven and documented fact. This isn't new to anyone who study history, but completely new to people who have always been fed very white depictions of the First World War. And that's sort of something I return to very much in my book. Because going back to the years I spent researching that, I looked at message boards online, forums, YouTube comments, the worst places you can imagine. That's where I was reading hundreds upon hundreds of comments from before the game Battlefield 1 was released and throughout the first year after it was released, and even up until 2020. Just reading these comments, people asking, why are black people being included in this game? That doesn't make sense. It's historical inaccuracy, and so on and so on. And that brings us to, what is historical authenticity to these people? Because when you think about it, and we see this whether it's film or books or whatever, you always need to have a sense of disbelief when you watch films and stuff, because stuff is going to happen on the screen that didn't happen in real life. They're going to do stuff that might be impossible for someone to do. In video games, you're going to have weapons or vehicles that never would have seen. Some in Battlefield 1, there were prototype weapons that never even reached the battlefield. There were like just 5 examples of them in actual real life. They have no issues with these things, but they have an issue with people of African ancestry being in the game, for example. And that's something I explore very much in depth in the book. And that is tied to just this notion, this explanation. Yes, they do believe in this white mystic space, which overtakes everything else because whiteness becomes a mark of authenticity. And as we've talked in the past, you mentioned it very briefly before, the end result of this is the dehumanization of people of color. It is to tell them that they don't have a place in these white spaces, that their past, their claim to a European past is denied, that it's an impossibility, that it's trivial. Or if you're going on the Wikipedia page for 1917 and you look at the historical accuracy part, you're going to see that they say that the African participation, the Black British participation, is negligible, which can be read as it doesn't matter. So why are they here? But the reality is that history, the past, is so much more complicated and so much more interconnected than we sometimes give it credit for. Because there are so many things, human agency, all sorts of events that bring people from one side of the world to another. Now, it's worth remembering that Morgan and I, we both trace our ancestry to Latin America, to South America, to Argentina in Morgan's case, to Chile in my case. But I am not talking to you from Chile. I am talking to you from Sweden. And when you back home think about Sweden, you don't think about a man of mixed indigenous and Spanish descent living in Sweden. You think of a blonde, blue-eyed man talking to you right now. That's not me. That's not my family. And maybe in 100 years, they're gonna wonder, well, it doesn't make sense. Why is there a man from South America in Sweden? That doesn't make any sense. That's historically inaccurate. Obviously, that's how it's always going to be. And well, hopefully that's not always how it's going to be, but that's how we see it so far. That's how, because sometimes, I am in my studying, and where the people I research, they are of this belief and they are not going to let go. Because again, you could say, well, Stefan, why don't you just engage with them? Why don't you just tell them, well, here are the facts. Here are, there were black British soldiers fighting in all white regiments, like as depicted in 1917 and in Battlefield 1. Why don't you just tell them? That's because I'm not the first one to do so. People have tried to do that in the past. And what happens is that they reject it. They always find an argument to say, well, it doesn't matter. They will use a numerical argument saying, well, maybe there were like 5, maybe there were like 7. It doesn't, they shouldn't be represented, as if there's a quota of like, this is how many there has to be before they have to be represented on screen. It's it's silly, it's nonsense, but it's part of this racist belief where people of color have to justify their existence with no guarantee, I mind you, no guarantee that they will be listened to. And we see this repeatedly, not just in the case of 1917 or Battlefield 1. We see this everywhere. Lord of the Rings, as I told you, Star Wars. When Force Awakens came out, you see John Boyega as a stormtrooper. Everyone went nuts on Twitter, just saying, "Well, they can't be black stormtroopers." But even to the most innocent things, one thing that I have spent a long time researching is Frozen 2. There were people who questioned the fact that there was a man of African ancestry in the animated film by Disney, Frozen 2. It might seem ridiculous to a listener right now, thinking, well, why would people bother? But that's because people have this belief that they shouldn't belong there, and that usually they're being forcibly inserted. Forced diversity, blackwashing. In my book, for example, I talk, yes, PC culture. In my book, I talk very specifically about how individuals look towards this sort of far right discourse to sort of explain why this is happening. Because they know because for these people, they know it's historically inaccurate. There's no doubt in their mind. They shouldn't be there. So to explain why it's happening, they turn to far right discourse. Sometimes very extreme ones. I found a lot of white nationalist talking points, and obviously, in the case of Battlefield 1, people repeating a lot of these talking points who were visibly not trolls. They were people who had a long history. You could see, like on the official Battlefield 1 forum, for example, you could see that they had been there for quite some times, and when Battlefield 1 comes out, they start talking like this. There was a very sad post by this 17-year-old who specifically said he was 17-year-old, who's like, I know they, could it possibly, I don't want to get political, but could it possibly be cultural Marxism, he wrote. But then adding, but I actually don't know what cultural Marxism really is. Which is funny, but it's also sad because it also talks to something to something more serious, which is the radicalization of teenagers online.
And of reactionarism online as well. Because at this point, reactionarism is just reacting to absolutely nothing, like you're saying, without even knowing what exactly they're even talking about. There is just a reaction just because there is a sense of peril, like their mythic space is being threatened by something that maybe wasn't even there, like Frozen 2, for example, like assuming that there were no people of African origin or ancestry living in Norway. Uh, it, it's uh, it's a very stupid hill to die on, first of all, but it's also a very, again, it's a very dangerous mindset because it narrows people's focuses so much. It forces people to focus on the tiniest of details. uh, it can even be detrimental to the enjoyment of art, because you cannot even enjoy art if you're trying to nitpick every single tiny aspect of everything.
Yeah. And here's the thing. Here's the important thing that we need to bring up. In the case of 1917 of Battlefield 1, these are not main characters. These are literally extras. Now, in the case of Battlefield 1, in the multiplayer mode, you are taking on the role of it. But in the case, for example, of 1917, which made people upset, these are literally people who were background extras. That's what people get upset about. We once had a question on Ask Historians asking about the film The Darkest Hour, which is a Winston Churchill biopic, where their main focus was could there have been a black British person on the tube on the subway in London, because they were so fixated on this one black person in the background of one specific scene.
Yeah, and it also speaks to a certain amount of universalization of personal experiences. Because one thing that usually happens to us in Ask Historians is that since Reddit is a majority US based site and many of its users are based in the US, a lot of people look at global history through the lens of US history. So, someone asking that question about the tube in the 1940s is a person who is thinking about Jim Crow United States. It's a person who is thinking about segregation in a scale that didn't necessarily exist outside of the US. Uh, because, for example, there was never at any point in Argentinian history anything even remotely resembling uh, the United States segregation between African American people and white people. That never even existed here. And that is also, and I know that it's also the case for many countries in a lot of parts of the world. But there's this tendency to universalize uh, our own personal experiences and our own histories is also, I think, something that plays a very, very major role in the continuation and the constant uh, reproduction, so to speak, of these spaces, of these mythic
Mhm.
spaces.
Mhm.
Um,
And I mean, in conclusion, we could also bring forth the fact that I specifically mentioned that in the book that the white mythic space as a theory is an explicitly anti-racist theory, and that also that don't just look at the perpetrators. It is concerned, obviously, wants to sort of explain the racist discourse, but it also is concerned about the victims, about the people who are affected by it. Because we might think that, this doesn't really hurt people, it's just racist people online. But the truth is that by denying the existence of people of color in popular media and public representation, you are in extension denying them a place in the modern world, in modern Europe, modern other places where that is considered, non-black essentially. So essentially, what they're saying is that you can't be black and you can't be Swedish, for example. You can't be black and German, for example. It's that ever-present idea that you don't belong, that race is something that is geographically fixed. Sweden is only white. It can't be, biracial. It can't be black. It can't be Asian. It can only be white. Germany, the same. And it comes down to even comments such as, "Where are you really from?" You know, if you even look different from the rest, where are you really from? People who are immigrants, people who are uh, children to immigrants, that's something that they likely have experienced at least once, where they get questioned about where do they actually belong. And I want to, of course, end it to say that, representation is important. It is incredibly important. And it does change perceptions, because I often say that, I am not here to change the minds of people who believe in the white mystic spaces, because their minds can't be changed. There are hardcore believers, but it is the people the children in particular who will grow up with these films, with the video games, with the books, the artwork and stuff like that, they will see these as their representation, their historical memory, and they will include it in theirs. Not all of them, of course, but a great majority will. Where it will become more normalized to see this thing, where it won't be questioned. But that obviously requires more meaningful representation too for people of color in popular culture as well, where they're not just relegated to extras that white racists online get mad about. Because if you really want to make them really mad, make them main characters.
Well, Stefan, thank you so much for joining me today and for chatting with me about these fascinating and very, very important topics. Thanks.
It's been an absolute pleasure.
And well, I'll be seeing everyone on Ask Historians. We will be posting this soon. So thank you everyone for listening in.
You've been listening to the Ask Historians podcast. Please support us at patreon.com/askhistorians. Find more history like this by following us on Twitter and Facebook, and by visiting us at askhistorians.reddit.com and ask hundreds of historians and enthusiasts anything you want to know about history.